Welcome to Schweitzer Drive, a podcast where we explore what goes on between the generation of electricity and the light switch. Join Dave Whitehead as he interviews the entrepreneurs, innovators, and experts who are inventing the future of electric power.
Hi, I'm Dave Whitehead, and welcome to Schweitzer Drive. Approximately 50% of the electricity generated in the Pacific Northwest comes from hydropower. It's why folks living in the region enjoy some of the most reliable, clean, low-carbon, and affordable energy in the nation. Unlike wind and solar, hydropower is a renewable resource that is dispatchable 24/7, but it's not without controversy. Today, I'm talking with Rick Dunn, General Manager of Benton PUD, about the challenges and opportunities for hydropower. Rick has more than 37 years of electric power and utility systems engineering and operation experience in both the public and private sectors. He is a native of the Tri-Cities, Washington area, and has been with Benton PUD since 2007. As General Manager, Rick functions as the Chief Executive Officer overseeing all of Benton PUD's business operations with headquarters in Kennewick. Benton PUD provides electricity to over 130,000 people through more than 57,000 service connections located throughout Benton County. His previous utility experiences include working at Umatilla Electric Cooperative in Hermiston, Oregon, and Salt River Project in Phoenix, Arizona. Rick graduated from Washington State University in 1986 with a Bachelor's of Science degree in Electrical Engineering, go Cougs, and is a licensed professional engineer. Hi, Rick, and thanks very much for coming in and talking about this, hydropower and the impact it has on our area. I'm really excited for this episode.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it. It's just an honor to be here with Schweitzer folks and back in Pullman. So Thank you.
There we go. All right, let's jump right into this. How did you get into the electric power business?
I love these questions because I'm getting down the road of my career and I hadn't thought about it in a long time, but I think it's an interesting story. Like a lot of people in their careers, it's a series of nudges that kind of move you. And I think what's really neat about it is one of the nudges came from Ed Schweitzer and SEL. So when I was in high school and junior high, Atari video games were all the rage, so my mom worked for engineers. She was a secretary for engineers and used to hint around about engineering being a respected field, and they drive nice cars and, decent homes. And so she kind of nudged me a little bit. And then my high school math and science teachers in particular brought it up. And I thought, let's look more into what it means to maybe work for Atari, electronics and video games. And so then it became, that's kind of a general direction I might go. And I ended up at Columbia Basin College studying pre-engineering, transferred to Pullman, got married, and came up here to beautiful Pullman with my wife, and started down the electrical engineering path. And, like all students, you got to take some electives. And so in my junior year, I took a power lab elective. And back then, all of the electrical engineering classes were in Carpenter Hall.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember standing down in the hallway, probably in a panic over what grade I got on the last test. And it's a little vague, but there were cork boards and there was a paper posted on the cork board, and it was about Schweitzer digital protective relaying. And it must have been a grad student or something, because I think Ed finished his doctorate maybe just a couple of years before that. But I saw this whole idea of digital protective relaying. I took a power lab. And then the biggest nudge came from Pacific Gas and Electric. They used to come to WSU. I don't know if they still do or not, but out of San Francisco. And they were here on a career day recruiting mission. I got introduced to a recruiter. I still remember his name, Bob Stewart from PG&E. If you're still out there, Bob, thank you. But one of the things they brought was a video of staged fault testing that they were doing on a 500 kV line. And they were shooting a little thin wire up into the line. And boy, I thought that was something else. And so I learned about protection engineering and system protection. And after reading about Ed's work in digital relaying, I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to become a system protection engineer. And first job I took actually was at SRP in Phoenix. Mm-hmm. They were one of the early users of SEL products. If I remember right, it was the 121, SEL 121, I think.
Yeah, we probably made a special version for SRP at the time, too.
Yeah. So I had a goal of being a protection engineer. I worked in their rotational engineering program. They do 6-month assignments. I got through 4 of them. I did 1 in protection. They offered me a permanent job. So I was right on track. Well, then I got an unsolicited offer to move back to the Northwest. Mm-hmm. So my wife and I, to be quite honest, living through 2 summers in Phoenix and then having this opportunity to kind of go back home. We ended up back up in the Northwest. And so I've been in consulting. I've been field service engineer. Now I've been at Benton for 17 years, and I spent about 10 years at another utility. But I will tell you this, and because I'm here with my Schweitzer friends, Schweitzer's been a part of like my path every year. You know, I wasn't a full-time protection engineer this whole time, but I've used SEL products in generation and transmission applications. I was a test engineer, started up 500 kV switch yards, and just a lot of really cool stuff. And Schweitzer was there all the time. I take credit for a novel application I developed on Schweitzer's 351 relays before you had recloser controls.
Well, that's some history too, because I started at SEL 30 years ago, and that was the very first product I worked on. I designed the hardware for the 351.
Oh man, we're going to have a lot to talk about.
Oh yeah, that's a great product. That's great. You've recently been publishing on Substack, and maybe in the show notes we can put a link to it. A lot of great articles. I've read a few of your columns and can tell that you put a lot of work into them. First of all, what prompted you to become a writer, especially being an electrical engineer? You know, that's really not in our generally in our wheelhouse.
Yeah. You know, with me, there's a short answer, and then I'll fill in the background. You know, the short answer, to be blunt, is just frustration with energy ignorance and engineering ignorance with our elected officials. And then secondly, not feeling heard as a utility executive. And so the backstory behind that is I was the director of engineering, but at Benton PUD when I first came to work there. And then I took over the power management division. And in power management, you're talking about your wholesale power supply. And of course, for consumer-owned utilities, it's the Bonneville Power Administration that provides the bulk of our wholesale power supply. I guess the bigger point is that like most engineers, I wanted to stay back at the shop working on engineering stuff. Mm-hmm. And when you get into the power supply side, you get introduced to the politics, whether you like it or not. You know, and it's always been the case, you know, whether it's hydro or whether it's any energy sources, that politics plays a big part of it, and energy policies play a big part of it. So that got me over into Olympia and meeting with staff, you know, different elected official staff. But to kind of cut the story shorter, I was involved with investor-owned utilities and some other utilities on doing some studies in the run-up to the passage of the 100% Clean Electricity Transformation Act in Washington. And what we did as utilities is we said, well, look, there's a way to approach decarbonization of the electricity sector that maintains the balance of affordability, reliability, and being environmentally responsible. And so we did a study and kind of got a little bit of an audience. But then the next study we did was on grid reliability. If you're going to move down this path to a carbon-free electricity grid, what do you got to do to make sure it's reliable? And the answer was, first of all, we don't really have a dirty energy problem in Washington by any stretch of the imagination. And that's thanks to the hydro system. And the hydro system is, you know, 60% of Washington's portfolio on an annual energy basis. So we could afford to be a little more rational in a transition to carbon-free, and that would involve natural gas. And so if you're going to shut down coal, which we're doing, if you want to keep the grid reliable, you're going to need natural gas because it's a dependable, dispatchable resource that can actually balance supply and demand minute by minute, which is what the grid requires. It's, as I always say, an unforgiving law of grid physics. So when we finished those studies, it just didn't feel like we were being heard. And so now here we are on this path, and we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of the consequences of that. But so then back to the Substack, I found myself in the middle of a controversy around the carbon-free electricity policies due to a big wind project that's being proposed in Benton County, the largest wind project in Washington State, 850 megawatts of wind turbines, over 200 turbines the size of the Space Needle. And obviously it's got ecological and environmental impacts, and the community is really opposed to it. And so I found myself in the middle of that with people in our community who trust us and trust me and saying, well, what's your take? You know? And so I got incremented into taking positions on that. And eventually I woke up on the night before Veterans Day last November and had been reading a couple of folks who I follow on Substack and said, you know, I wonder if I could do that. And I woke up and I had written a few op-eds. I had testified in congressional hearings. I had done various writings and different things. But the one thing I was always frustrated by as an engineer is that they never let me put graphics in anything, you know, so I couldn't explain it on on a chart. Charts say a lot. And in an op-ed, it's usually less than 1,000 words and no graphics. So, take this complex topic, tell us everything you know about it in under 1,000 words and convince me, your position. And so anyway, so Substack provides the opportunity to self-publish, uncensored. It's free. You can have people subscribe to it without paying. It also has the means to what I'd say go viral with the messaging. Not that I think I'm, going to make that big of an impact, but, let's all chip in. And the real objective was that, with all due respect to, there's many elected officials I have great respect for that do know what's going on. But really my goal was to speak to our community and to the region on a more grassroots level.
Yeah.
And so Substack provided opportunity to perhaps go viral with messaging that I say is deeper than a bumper sticker, right? I mean, and we need that if we're really going to have, rational plans to go forward. So that's, there's more we could talk about on the Substack, but it's out there, and it's rickdunn.substack.com, and it's free. And if, get a cup of coffee, because they're 10 to 15 minute articles. You're not gonna, they're not gonna read them fast.
No, they're great. If for everybody listening to this, go swing by there and take a read. It's a lot of graphics, a lot of information. If you're an engineer, you'll love them. And if you're an elected official, you'll learn a lot from them too. As I mentioned in the intro, the Pacific Northwest enjoys some of the lowest electricity rates in the nation, and that's been the case for a long time, thanks to an abundance of hydroelectric power. However, those prices are beginning to go up. Will you talk about what you're seeing in terms of energy cost and what's behind those increases? Yeah,
I think it's really important to make sure you understand there's really at least two distinct types of utilities. One is the investor-owned utilities in the Northwest, and then the other are the consumer-owned utilities like co-ops, munis, and PUDs. The reason I say that is that the latter are off-takers of the federal hydro system, the 31 dams on the Columbia and Snake River system. That's our primary power supply. Those are marketed by the Bonneville Power Administration. Bonneville operates and owns 75% of the transmission system in the Northwest. So they are the show when it comes to consumer-owned utilities. And so the pricing, the increases in energy costs that you're seeing, while there's some consumer-owned utilities have had increases, Benton we haven't had a rate increase since 2019. So, and the answer to why is that is because we've had abundant, affordable hydro that's met our needs. But those days are changing. In fact, they're over. On the investor-owned utility side of things, they benefit from Bonneville's presence, but they have their own generation resources, including coal, natural gas. Not a lot. We have a very small coal footprint in the Northwest, but there's a few, and they are a part of the, reliable grid. So what you're seeing are IOUs in particular, and Puget Sound Energy in particular in our state, and I love them. They're great folks and have good, colleagues there, and so it's not bashing Puget. Same with the Vista over here in Spokane. But Puget has coal in their portfolio, and CETA, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, abolishes coal at the end of 2025. So you can't have any coal. And there are financial penalties for any CO2 emissions that begin in 2030. And so any development of new resources that have CO2 emissions right now is frowned upon, and nobody's doing it. So the cost increases are coming from big investments in renewable technology. And so renewables, while they have free fuel, are not cheap when it comes to upfront capital costs. Mm-hmm. So that's part of it. And the other thing is when you take dependable generation offline, because renewables are intermittent and variable, that's not just an inconvenience. It's a serious problem for grid reliability, because you have to have generation that you can count on that shows up, in the future, and in the moment. And you have to be able to anticipate that. And so you have to overbuild those generation technologies to try to increase the probability that there will be enough that shows up.
Yeah.
So another word for that is overbuild. So you have a high upfront cost and you have to overbuild it. And so that's what you're seeing. And that's what they've said. Portland General Electric in Oregon has said the same thing. PacifiCorp, who has service territory in Washington and Oregon, they're also in that boat. And so that's predominantly what you're seeing. Another factor, which may not be known by a lot of folks, is wildfire risk. And the insurance premiums that are coming with that, PacifiCorp just settled a big lawsuit in Oregon. And it was in the headlines of the weekly energy news letter that I read, that the insurance premiums went from somewhere in the 20 millions to over 200 million. And nobody wants to see people injured or die or have their property damaged by wildfires, but trees in contact with power lines are becoming a bigger liability. And so you're actually seeing PacifiCorp saying that in their public statements, that's becoming a big additional cost to them. And we can talk more about that. But, the idea that building, for example, wind projects in states 2 or 3 states away is a really good part of a future clean energy strategy. You got to think about, well, what does that do in terms of your exposure to transmission line liabilities that might come with that if you happen to be an owner of those. So
that's interesting. I hadn't thought much about that side of it.
And I'd say, maybe to round it out, I mentioned that Bonneville off-takers have been fairly insulated from that, but those days are over. The firm capability of the federal hydro system is spoken for. So, and what firm capability looks like is, well, what's the amount of generation you can get from the federal system in the worst water year?
Yeah.
As a power grid planner, that's what you have to plan on. We're happy when we get average or we get above average, but that's not what the contracts are based on. It's not what we get guaranteed. So any load growth that utilities are experiencing, whether it's incremental and kind of organic or whether it's spot loads around industrial development or, other job opportunities that a lot of economic development folks want to bring to bear, the incremental costs, just to put it in perspective, our tier 1 or that firm capability is about $36 a megawatt hour. When you get into the second tier or load growth, it's 62. And that 62 number changes every rate period. And their two-year rate periods, it's currently at 62. So that's a big jump. So that's the pressure we're all starting to feel as we're starting to grow. And if you're going to electrify natural gas end uses, if you're going to electrify transportation, that's part of the organic growth. And then there's the discussion about data centers and AI and where does that all fit in. And so just want people to know that we love hydro. Hydro is the foundation and has been the foundation of economic development and low-cost electricity in the Northwest for decades. But it's squeezed to its limits. We're happy to have it. But if we're going to move forward, we're going to have other resources. And so there's pressure coming to all of us eventually.
In a recent column, you talked about how critical hydro was during the polar vortex last January. Will you talk us through what happened and what was all involved?
The first thing I would say is that, and I use these words not lightly at all, our hydropower is like nowhere else in the United States. And I'm not sure I think we have a general sense of that. But just to put it in perspective, like I said earlier, Washington State's annual energy portfolio is about 60% hydro. The rest of the country is 60% fossil fuels from electricity generation standpoint. The balance of the country gets 6% of the electricity from hydro. So we're in a whole different ball game. When you look at primary energy across all sectors, hydro represents 2%. And so I just want people to know this is a unbelievably unique position that we're in. And especially under 100% carbon-free mandates, we shouldn't squander it.
No, I agree.
All right. So now to put it in perspective and without graphics, but I can give you a number because megawatts, you get lost in megawatts pretty easy. But if you think about the Northwest grid in this polar vortex event in January, you got to say, well, how much electrical demand was there? And the answer depends on how big of a footprint you want to look at. So if you look at the greater Northwest footprint, which is the typical Northwest states you would think of in the Pacific Northwest, and then expand to Utah and Wyoming in your mind, that's kind of how the power flows, and down into Idaho, of course, and Nevada a little bit. But in that footprint, the demand for electricity reached about 55,000 to 59,000 to be precise. So in that 55 to 60,000 megawatts. Hydropower was the number one individual technology that was brought to bear to meet that demand, reaching levels in I'd say the 15 to 20,000 range. We've had better. And to be quite honest, this year this winter did not set up that well for hydro, but thank God it was there. The other thing people don't realize is while we don't have a lot of coal-fired power plants, we do have a fair amount of natural gas. About the other 50% comes from those two resources. And so what happened in that event was you had natural gas and coal combining for about 25 to 30,000 megawatts. So together, just a little bit more than hydro was kicking in. But the real story that that was surprising, I think, to most people in the Northwest in the utility space is we were importing over 5,200 average megawatts across all 120 hours of that cold event. So it was a 5-day stretch, 24 hours. And the Northwest isn't really known for importing a lot of electricity. It's been, more as we've kind of grown and we've seen population growth and industrial growth. And we've always had a relationship with California since the 60s. We've had transmission lines, DC line, AC lines that go to California. But that net flow on that AC DC interconnection to California on a typical year and historically has always been north to south.
Yeah.
And this event, it flipped. And it flipped, and it wasn't California generation, by the way, that was providing the help. It was actually generation in Arizona. And
at the nuke plant down there?
Palo Verde, I'm sure, was kicking in, and other thermal plants really located as far east as the Western Rockies. And so that's where the help came from, and that was very unique. And it wasn't wind and solar that was providing the help. It was these reliable resources because it was across day and nighttime hours, which was very surprising. Bonneville, with this abundant hydro that they have in their fleet, was a net purchaser of over $300 million.
Wow. In
just that short period. So hydro is fantastic, but it is variable and it doesn't always set up exactly right. But again, thankfully it was there. The other thing that happened, which is really important for people to understand, is that the wind power in the Northwest in many balancing areas, and the balancing areas are utilities whose job it is to balance supply and demand on a minute-by-minute basis. Bonneville's a balancing area. Avista, Puget, they're all balancing areas. But the wind in many balancing areas actually went to zero. Okay, and say, well, it was blowing somewhere, wasn't it? It's like, well, a little bit. But as you moved over to Montana and even into Wyoming and other states, the wind actually dropped off 94%. So we didn't see that geographical diversity benefit that a lot of wind and solar advocates often talk about. The wind will be blowing somewhere until it isn't, right? And it wasn't. And so we were in trouble. Solar produces only during the day. Winter peaks happen early in the morning before the sun comes up and late, after the sun goes down. Nuclear's Columbia Generating Station was flatting on and doing great. But, fundamentally, I think the thing that people need to recognize is that we haven't really even begun to decarbonize the electricity sector beyond the level that it's already decarbonized. What we've done to this point in the Northwest is we've retired about 2,000 megawatts of coal. One coal-fired power plant that should be on people's radar is Centralia. Unit 2, which is scheduled to retire next year. Previous unit already retired. And the reason I bring that up is imagine 5,200 megawatt deficit in imports under that polar vortex event. Now take away the 730 megawatts that's sitting over there on the I-5 corridor where all the population centers are, and do it again. And so where do you get your electricity from, right? Where are you going to get it? Yeah. So, and I think the other thing, if we're going to continue to shut down coal, what this event said is that new natural gas plants have to be on the table. A lot of political folks don't want to hear that, but I think you're starting to hear that more from folks, including Bonneville Power Administration executives. We're already relying on the hydro system. Like I said, it's king, but we're going to deepen our dependence on its capabilities as you shut down the other dispatchable resources. And so if it's tapped out, we don't have a whole lot more we can do with it. And the hydro system is not infinitely flexible, right? I mean, it's constrained by fish requirements, by barging, by flood control, all these things. So it's not that simple. Well, just hold the water back and you'll have it. There's coordination with Canada and storage. And so there's a lot of complexity there. And then I'd say in the end, we need every drop of hydropower we can get. That event really emphasized that.
I agree. So let's talk a little bit about hydro and dams. For decades, there's been especially today, there's heated discussions and debates about breaching 4 dams on the lower Snake River. We talk about these resources from an engineering and utility perspective, and how important are these dams to our region's energy mix?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is that under the constraints of 100% CO2 emission-free electricity, hydro becomes exponentially valuable, right? That's the first point. The other point would be, and I tell you what, this is a very politically charged and emotionally charged and argument that's been going on for a long time. But the lower Snake River dams are not expensive. They're some of the lowest resource cost generation that we have. They're not outdated. They're really world-class facilities if you haven't been to them. They're world-class in terms of turbine generators, but also fish bypass facilities. I work with salmon biologists from the Corps and other places, and one of them said one time that these dams are invisible to the adult salmon when they come back, and they really are. And then finally, they're not surplus. Okay. And people talk about how they're such a small part of the quote regional power supply. But it's really important to understand that the BPA customer utilities, the off-takers of the federal hydro system, we are preference customers of Bonneville by federal statute. Those are our resources, legally speaking.
Yeah.
And there are over 130 customers of BPA spread across all the Northwest states. So just in your mind, imagine you have all these little communities and the big communities, Seattle and Tacoma are involved too. The Snake River dams are about 10% historically. They've been diminished a bit by increased spill lately, but it's roughly 10% of the portfolios of over 130 utilities. So then that kind of dials it in. Is that there's not this ubiquitous region that could just toss aside the hydro and easily replace it. You have to look now at the individual utility portfolio and say, that's an impact, a significant impact. And you think, well, 10%, what's that? That can't be. Well, 10% is a big deal when the only generation resource that you can replace it with has to be carbon free.
Yeah.
Right. And so that I think really puts it in perspective. The other thing about the lower Snake River dams is there's 3,000 megawatts roughly of nameplate capacity that they provide. But from a balancing area authority standpoint, Bonneville, I mentioned earlier, is a BA. They often rely on Snake River dams for about 25% of their operating reserves, which I call blackout insurance. So it's that generation technology that's standing by that can be flexed up or down to balance supply and demand. You have some weather events are a little unexpected. We're getting pretty good at forecasting, but as a weather event comes in, they have to stack up their system and generation resources in a way that provides some reserves, right? In case of emergency, a generation unit trips off somewhere else, a transmission line trips off. Snake River dams are up to 25% of those operating reserves. And then I'd say the science is not settled. I've been really personally involved in the salmon debate. It's very complex. There's a lot of dimensions. We could probably do a whole podcast easily for an hour just talking about that. So I won't. But we really got to think about ocean conditions, predation, harvest practices, harvest management, the impacts of non-native species like walleye and bass.
Yep.
I heard the other day walleye, 50% of their diet are small salmon.
Oh, I bet.
And, nobody wants to give up their, little piece of the action, but we're going to have to, figure that out. And so that's kind of where I would kind of leave it. There's a whole lot more that we could talk about. I think the Snake River Dam issue, in my experience, has been politicized more than ever before.
Yeah.
And, I've been back to DC and we're watching the federal government really partner, unfortunately, with the states of Oregon and Washington to diminish hydro, generally speaking, but very specifically, they have normalized dam breaching and the Snake River Dam breaching as part of an absolute necessary measure. And I'll just leave it at that. That's unfortunate.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of hydros. You can probably tell. In preparation for this, I just started scratching my head, and I use the same 3,000 megawatts of capacity with those 4 dams. And I said, okay, if we're going to breach them, where are we going to get our electric power from? And say, all right, let's go down the solar path, right? So how much solar would you need? I did some quick calculations, and let's assume the actual output for the period of time for solar runs at, say, 20% in the Pacific Northwest, just to use a number.
You could probably round it up to 25%. But we'll take your 20. All right.
Well, let's just do 20 because that's the math I did, right? So I said, using that number, how in square miles, how many square miles of capacity would you need to install in solar? And I come up with my math, and somebody can check me that's listening, to about 56 square miles of solar panels. And now to put 56 square miles, or 54.4 square miles, put that into context, the city of Anaheim is 50 square miles. Spokane covers about 70 square miles. So we're in your area, It's Kennewick, Pasco, and Richland combined are about 108 square miles. So if we just took essentially Kennewick is about call it 30 square miles, and Pasco. So if we covered all of Kennewick and all of Pasco with solar panels, we could peak produce probably the output. Now, I haven't talked about what happens at nighttime and where we're going to get the batteries to store all this energy, right? So this is, I mean, you just start putting in these scales. It's like, I'm just a dumb engineer, but this just does not pencil out.
Yeah, and everybody does the mental gymnastics to try to figure out how they're going to do it. But let me assure you, there are studies that have already been done that try to answer that question. Replacing hydro with intermittent and variable wind and solar, it's not apples and apples, obviously.
No.
Right? So there's the energy piece, and this idea that any energy is good energy as long as it's CO2 free, misses the point about reliability.
Yeah.
And so I already mentioned Snake River dams have a defined role in that, and the ability to ramp hydro up and down. It's a controllable technology, and wind and solar are not controllable. They effectively look like negative load on the grid is the way to think about it, right? So it reduces the load on the grid that's presented to the dependable technology that's controllable to balance it.
Oh.
So without spending too much more time, there are many studies that show that your math is heading in the right direction. If you add wind and solar together plus batteries, you still have the problem of multi-day cold events that involve no sunshine or maybe no wind. So then how do you have adequate storage to get across that? And so in the end, what it is, it's overbuilding technologies that are inherently deficient in their ability to be controlled, right? They cannot be controlled. And so what you do is you stack up capital investment. And so what that does is raises that cost, and that increases electric rates. And, it depends on which study you look at. But I've seen estimates, that they would increase electricity rates 25 to 50%.
Oh, wow.
Just from those dams being removed. And so, it's challenging and it's complex and it's hard for the average person, especially when hydro's been so politicized. I mentioned this to you before we got on the air, that when you politicize something, people want to hear what tickles their ears, right? They don't necessarily want to hear the facts. They don't want to spend 15 minutes reading my Substack. They just want a factoid they can drop on their friends and relatives that maybe have a different political view. So
that's very, very true. You serve on the board of director for Northwest River Partners, and NSEL also has some representation on that board. Will you talk to us about what the mission of the organization is?
Yeah, it's a good thing I wrote it down. I think I knew it, but the mission statement for Northwest River Partners, which by the way is a hydropower advocacy group, I think it's been around since the early 2000s, maybe 2004. But our mission is to lead the charge for the Northwest to realize its clean energy potential using hydroelectricity as the cornerstone. I mentioned earlier that hydro in the Northwest is like nowhere else. And by the way, we love salmon. We love our tribal partners. We want everybody to move forward together and all of our interests be served. One of the things that River Partners, well, first of all, the primary representation of River Partners are consumer-owned utilities. That's really where the heart of it is. And in fact, little side note, the reason Schweitzer's on the board, I had a little something to do with that. I was actually listening to a podcast that Ed Schweitzer was on, and he was talking with Kathy McMorris Rogers and maybe Dan Newhouse. And then I discovered that Schweitzer, that SEL was a big hydro fan. And I went to a River Partners board meeting and said, we're trying to recruit industry partners and other folks. We have IBEW representatives on River Partners board now. And I mentioned it. And then one of my colleagues at Idaho Falls Power, Bear Prairie, knows somebody here at Schweitzer. And he goes, well, I'll call so-and-so, and the rest is history. So you guys have joined.
Well, there we go. Yeah, I didn't know the backstory.
Yeah. So, and we're very happy to have you. And Chris is a great contributor. But I'd say in summary, the history of River Partners has been, they started out getting entrenched in the legal battles, spending money on the legal fight. The Salmon Recovery is an Endangered Species Act issue, and it's complicated. And so they got really sucked into that. Over the last number of years, we've shifted. Our strategic focus is really more of a hearts and minds approach, that the legal battles will be fought by others. And we've coordinated with our other trade association partners. And so that's been our focus, doing things like digital media campaigns to try to make sure that hydro retains its positive image in the Northwest that people understand under the current policies. I mean, it's always been great, but now with 100% carbon free as a requirement, we want to make sure people understand how critical it is and that we should not squander it. We really advocate for science-based solutions. We partner with our members and with Native American tribes. We had a great meeting one time up in Spokane with the Upper Columbia tribes regarding reintroduction of salmon above Grand Coulee, and it was really an impactful experience for me. And so I just want to leave people with it's a heated battle. Being an advocate of hydropower, you might think is easy, and it's not. There's some folks who really oppose it big time.
Wow.
That want to see dams breached, and it's gotten, it's reached a really high level, like I said, of politicization that I haven't seen in a long time. And so we want to keep engaging in the public processes, going back to D.C. I know Chris mentioned that Chris Carlson with Schweitzer had been back to D.C. here recently. Yep. And so, we just want to continue to message, be consistent, be data-driven, and make sure that our elected officials really understand what an asset we have and that we got to proceed carefully.
Well, if you could pull out your crystal ball, look ahead 25, 50 years, what do you see the future for hydroelectric power?
Yeah. Oh, man. So, I'm just to gain a little traction, and then, that's a very difficult question to answer, but I mentioned it before, but I will say that hydro is really on the ropes right now politically. I don't want to make this a hyper-political discussion, but the current federal administration and the current state administrations of Oregon and Washington have really teamed up like I've never seen before, through regulation, through the publishing of reports that are not new science. They're kind of rearrangements of science. I would even suggest pseudoscience has crept in, where there's, a bit of truth to it, and then they kind of use it to push a position. And so I don't want to make a judgment about what's going to happen in 25 years, but I will say this. I think clearly, because of the direction that it's been taken here recently, that part of the answer depends on who we elect.
Well, that can have a big impact. You're right.
Yeah, and I'm not campaigning for anybody. I'm just telling you, we have to hold folks accountable for their decisions that they're making. And right now, I think that's been the big frustration at River Partners, Public Power Council, which I'm on the board of. A lot of the negotiations that have been going on a federal level and a state level have been behind closed doors and not involving utilities. And you'll hear that, oh, well, we've always involved them. And I just want you to know that we were not involved in the real fundamental and final decisions. For example, normalizing Snake River Dam breaching in a federal report, right? Or in a state report. Continue to put study money in the state budget to look at breaching these facilities. So, it depends on who we elect. The other thing is that people need to understand that, and I had learned this just a few years ago, really. When it comes to the Endangered Species Act, hydropower, while it's a congressionally approved use of the federal facilities, it doesn't really have standing under ESA.
Oh, really?
It really doesn't. So you're negotiating, right? Why do I bring that up? Because there's always the chance of judicial activism, right? We've seen a little bit of that. So when it comes to the ESA, just for, hypothetically speaking, could a judge order massive amounts of spill and effectively, reduce the economic value of the hydro system? The answer is yeah, sure. We've had court-ordered spill.
Mm-hmm.
We're operating the hydro system right now under a massive spill regime, which I'll take a second and let me talk about that. The water presented to a dam, it's not complicated. It either goes through the turbine generators, goes over the spillway, or you hold it back, for a while. What has been advocated here over the last few years, it's been really frustrating, is to spill more of it. And you say, okay, well, why? Well, because we want to give the small salmon a better chance to get out to the ocean faster and without going through the turbines. And by the way, very few of them go through the turbines, like maybe 4%. The problem with putting water over a spillway is it gasifies the water. So it entrains gases in the water. And so the salmon can get the bends. So as you drive by the dams and you see the big frothy amounts of water that are accumulating below the spillways, just know that there's a level of total dissolved gas that can be actually fatal to the salmon. Historically, that TDG level was set by the state water quality standards in Washington and Oregon at about 110, 115% TDG. But now we're going to spill to 125%. So the threshold that used to be the critical level you should not exceed, otherwise you put the salmon in peril has now been adjusted up. And I call it a Hail Mary kind of, oh, let's just flush the salmon down the river by spilling up to 125% TDG. There's lots of other complications with that. Like you're putting more fish over the spillway, so you can't count as many of them. You don't even know how many are coming through as much.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So it really complicates things. I just want you to know that's something that has happened kind of behind the scenes. And we don't know if it's actually helping or harming the salmon, because the salmon's life cycle is, 2 or 3 years out in the ocean, it comes back. So it's going to be hard to know. And then the other thing is, if you're pulling too many levers at the same time, you have so many variables, you don't really know which one of them is actually working. And so that's a real problem. But I would say in the 25-year horizon, it's going to just stay in that political grinder. I don't know how to describe. I mean, it just feels like it is. I don't know. I think you could see an erosion of the hydro system through more spill orders. By the way, if you spilled to maximum levels on the Snake River dams and the 4 lower Columbia dams on the way down to Portland, you could reduce the hydro system's output by 1,200 average megawatts, which would be catastrophic to utilities right now. I'd end on this. Like, if I think about the past 25-year vision, and if I had a graph I could show all of you, think of the electricity demand curve, which I call the rhythm of life, right? It really is. You wake up in the morning, you do your thing, and whether it's winter or summer, that shape takes on a certain characteristic. But one thing it never does, it never goes to zero.
Nope.
And we rely on electricity for our health, safety, and well-being. So underneath that load curve, envision with me, close your eyes for a second and think about this. How about a layer cake of always-on nuclear power, and sitting on top is flexible hydro balancing demand, 100% carbon-free. So that's a long-game solution. I think hydro will always be a part of at least that. I hope it can be a bigger part. But we need baseload resources like nuclear, and I think that's where I would kind of end on it. Is there's you and I were talking about it before we got on the air. There's a rational plan to reduce carbon in the electricity sector, and that is a natural gas to nuclear transition could work. And in the Northwest, we have the benefit of hydro. So hopefully you can see that.
I agree with you 100%, Rick. Thanks for your time. This has been a great conversation. We'll have to have you back on. We could go on for hours and hours, Absolutely. I think, talking about electricity and sources and what's the right way to do things. I'm sure we have all the right answers, right? Just like everybody else. But Rick, thanks again for your time. We really appreciate it.
Dave. Really appreciate it too. Yeah.
Thank you for stopping by Schweitzer Drive. Join us again as we learn about, explore, and celebrate electric power. For more information about the show, please visit selinc.com/Schweitzer Drive.